So let's get going with these Q&As. Q&A library. What do you think is the best invention or improvement equipment design that came out of the course of a war? My answer would be either the boiling vessel or chop 'em armour. Yeah, well, as you've done it yourself, you put best in invention in inverted commas. I guess we're back to what's the criteria? What might be best for you? Best post-war, you know, some of these amazing medical discoveries, all sorts of things, you know, best in a bigger sense. You know, it's very hard to say value judge things because, you know, is it something like a Spitfire and a Hurricane who just happened to be there at the right moment? The Harrier went into service just in time for the Falklands War and tipped the air war balance in the Royal Navy's favour. You know, so many moments that way, but sometimes if you step back in the bigger picture, actually it might not have made a huge impact in that war, but look what it did to our lives. You know, some of those scientific discoveries, all the planning for, you know, we're using something you're watching via the internet, etc. So all of that was done as part of planning for what about if all the services go down, you know, in wartime and things. So it's a it's an interesting question, but you go around the table, you'll get as many people around that table will have a different answer, I'd assume, or I'd like to think that, because we all need to come up with what's our best. It doesn't mean to say it's the best for everybody all the time. Warren Rudkin says, I enjoyed the recent talk about submachine guns used by the UK during World War II. I was also surprised to see the collection of military firearms you had. My question is this: what types of weapons are British citizens allowed to own today, and do they have to be rendered inoperable? Thanks, Warren Rudkin. Now, if you really want to know this, the legal stuff is all on the Home Office website, so you can go there and it actually lists this through. What I've got what's called deactivated weapons. I'm not actually a shooter. I have shot in the past and things. There's about 1 million shotgun licenses issued every year in Britain, or I say issued every year, I'm not sure how often they get them renewed. So one of the things that I'm always interested in is, you know, myth versus reality. We like to pride ourselves, quite rightly, I would argue, in Britain and many European countries, that we have quite strict gun laws that has meant the use of firearms in civil disturbances, murders, whatever else, enormously lower, obviously, than what goes on in America from the point of view of the gun lobbies and everything else. And we can get in that debate in a separate issue there. But careful what we say there, because it's only in the 20th century that sense of we don't want people to have guns, really the legislation changed. And I've got the book, I think it's sitting up here somewhere, which is there's a history of the use of firearms in Britain, which is quite surprising because there's those lovely stories, you know, where the policeman in London, I think it was in about the 1890s, is fired on by a criminal he's chasing. The police, British police, they have a truncheon. They don't have any firearms that way unless they're specially issued for a certain event. And the policeman walks into a local saloon bar, the bar in the pub, and says, gentlemen, there's someone I'm chasing with a firearm. Could anyone lend me a revolver? And I think he says something like 6 people go to their coat pockets to offer the policeman the revolver that they were then obviously carrying perfectly legally themselves at the time. So this idea that we were always a society without guns is don't think that, you know, look back at your histories and you see it's done in a very different way. Only in the, like I said, the 20th century really did the laws start saying, no, we really don't want these things. At the moment, look on the website, it'll tell you we don't have live automatic weapons, etc. The issue that a lot of people get frustrated by at the moment is Britain, we had this idea that you could own a deactivated firearm that was done to a perfectly good standard, and that in Britain is now called old spec. And what happened is, because we had to go in after there was this shooting in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo shooting by those nutters in Paris, what happens after that is the European Union then changes the laws about deactivated guns. They'd had much looser laws in other parts of Europe, and some of the guns that were being used in that shooting were reactivated deacts, or in other words, guns that had been done to a European standard, deactivated, but the bad guys had got hold of them and reactivated them. So that meant Britain, being part then of the European Union, changed its laws to meet, which meant that the specification changed in Britain. We've now left the EU. The law is very clear, still written on the Home Office website about deactivated guns, but you'll notice there is a sense of shrugging the shoulders. Well, we're not part of the EU now. Does that really apply to us? And it sounds an awful thing to say, but the Home Office, the police, your local firearms officer is just not interested in that way, because he's got bigger fish to fry. So the fact this isn't a, what spec it is, where it is, and all those things there is still a bit of a confusion. But look around that. Don't take me as gospel on this. This is just, me throwing that one out there. But the idea that the private citizen can own old specification and new specification deactivated weapons, but there was this massive sense of discouragement. The problem of that, of course, is there's huge numbers, millions, I think over 1 million guns out there almost certainly, that deactivated because the collector picked them up. There was the old days where some, the police guy would say, oh, that's fine because it was, a pin was put in the barrel. That doesn't necessarily meet the current standards. So there is a definite standard that weapons and a certificate, it has to be stamped by the proof house or certificate is issued. And of course, as well, the other side of it, the reenactor fraternity, and then we go into the area that goes from the deactivated weapon to replica weapon to blank firing, and different sets of criteria for all of those, which you can see how it gets confusing. The only thing I would say, the most common sense and obvious thing to say to everybody is, don't go in anything stupid by trying to say to someone, oh, there's nothing to worry about here. Anyone walking around the streets of Britain or showing off guns in the wrong context, which is why I was making jokes in my back garden. It's all very well in the back garden, but I wonder what the person who walks his dog past thinks at certain times. You frankly deserve what you get. So, just remember that. And I say this all the time to things like reenactor enthusiast groups as well. Just remember that new young lad who's got his first replica gun or a DEAC or something, and you're there, you're at the event, you do all those things. Just make sure you've got club or house rules or whatever, and you match them. Don't let him think it's all right to sling his little carbine or his pistol still on his pocket and off he goes to the local co-op to pick up the pint of milk you all want with that over his shoulder, because not everyone else is going to understand that he's that reenactor, and not everyone else quite rightly wants to see things like that. Just again, to me it seems like pretty much common sense that way. But as I say, if you really want to know the laws, look on, it's written out there as clearly as it can be on the Home Office website, how people interpret that law. That's the interesting thing that people there. I got all my DEACs many moons ago, I think it was, and I know other people have got them as well, but they're still trying to work out what they're going to do in the future to keep in line with the law. Right, let me carry on then. David Eggleston. David, I know you have a Dingo. My grandfather commanded an M8 Greyhound armoured car during the Second World War. What's your favourite armoured car from the pre-1945 period? So pre-1945 up to the end of World War II, I would just go back to, for me, they've all got great stories. They've all got, they can bring so many things with them, where they fought, why they were built, all those, every vehicle's got something, I think. To me, though, if you're talking about an armoured car, the romance, the beauty even, for me, is with the Rolls-Royce armoured car. So first goes into service in the First World War, 1921 pattern, etc. we had at the Tank Museum. It's just, based on the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost chassis, it just looks the part, and then you see the images is out in things like the Northwest Frontier, in the Middle East, all these places it go to. It takes with it a sort of romance of the interwar period, you know, the adventure, or with the First World War, the Lawrence of Arabia connection, and everything. And there's something about it that I wish I had the language. You know, people like certain cars. Why do we like an E-Type? Why do we, you know, is it the history? Is it something about the beauty of certain machinery, the way they look, the way they sound, what they bring? For me, it's probably the associations with that vehicle. But having had the pleasure to see it run on quite a number of occasions, and, you know, there was a little friction with that Rolls-Royce armoured car that I didn't quite get in the same way with all the others, even though, you know, there's other things that the minute you see it, you think, oh, that takes me to that period or that battle or that film, you know, sometimes as well, where it's that way. So yes, moving on then. So we have Steve Mercer, 952. Hi David, great videos. We know that Zimmerit was largely a waste of time because nobody other than the Germans tried using magnetic mines or handheld magnetic mines. Does anybody know if the Russians deliberately didn't go down that road because of the Zimmerit? They weren't above resorting to some pretty desperate measures. Was the Zimmerit in fact a deterrent? Give Finn a pat from me. Well, I don't know if Finn deserves a pat at the moment. I think well, maybe he does now. He's fallen asleep. Zimmerit comes later. So, you know, it's not there at the beginning of the war when you might think if the Russians are looking at a range of things, they're not going, well, we won't build this, because it's not there to be worried about yet. If I'm honest, I very much doubt the Russians would have cancelled a whole weapon system or, you know, something that could have had a use because of something that wasn't present. You know, that magnetic mine would still be enormously useful on other vehicles that didn't have Zimmerit, soft skins and all sorts of things as well. And there's bound to be areas on a armoured vehicle that aren't covered. So my gut feeling is I'm not even sure if there's full analysis of what Zimmerit was from the Soviet side during the war. But I don't think they avoided doing that at the time because, like with so many things, it's also scale. You know, and if you look at the photographs, even then, even if they did know about Zimmerit and its purpose, even they would have realised, well, it's not actually present on all the vehicles and all the parts of a vehicle as well. So, you know, you could have got to, just as the armour's thickest on the front, they knew that, so they'd try and go to the sides. So there'd been probably ways around it. So I don't think that's a reason. I just think it wasn't something in their armouries. The lower deck, 40k. Thank you, David. Was there a tank design concept in World War II that you are surprised was discontinued or shelved? I did have a little think about this because it is a hard one. I'm trying to think, is there something obvious afterwards? You think, oh yeah, actually that was a bit of a shame. But of course, because it doesn't go forward, we don't miss it. We don't know what's there. The only one that you kind of, when you look at the story, I'm a great Sherman fan and everything, but there is that sense that Britain was very much aware that we need a bigger gun all the time. So the minute, you know, 6-pounder was done, it was designed, you know, drawings are ready in about 1940 and everything, aren't they? But it's a couple of years for all these reasons why it's delayed into service. We then go on to the 17-pounder because we know the Germans are coming with something bigger. So we better get ahead of the game. That does sound odd because, again, this idea, and again, I've talked about it before, but Leslie McNair saying, no, good enough's good enough. We're going to see that one through. Don't start wasting too much of your time and energies dissipating our resources. The 75mm seems good enough. Was it? You know, and everything. But there is that sense that for 2 years, the Sherman, from when it first appeared to many of them going ashore on D-Day, didn't change that much in terms, certainly in armour protection a little bit, but not in firepower. So was that 2 years missed at a time when you're almost seeing, as I've often said before, each fighting season, certainly for the Germans, you're looking at the following year, Hitler's basically saying, I want my army to be coming out with the next generation in terms of firepower, gun size, extra armour, etc. You know, so this progression bit that seemed inevitable. So maybe that's not really directly answering that, but maybe there was, if you look back, a missed opportunity there of doing something, even though it does come later. And obviously the 76 was developed for the Sherman. But again, that's another classic one to throw out there for all of you. You know, can you think of things that you think, oh, if only they'd have done that then and everything? But we do have, and this is this, I was going to read the line to you. I'll read it a bit later on, but this problem we all have, we've got the benefit of hindsight. They didn't know what that was the way that it was going. And how do you give a fair judgment to any of these things? You know, because when I read people saying, oh, you know, they didn't do this, oh, they were silly there, also. It's very hard to get into their view at the time to understand exactly what their pressures and issues were. That wasn't to say they didn't make mistakes. Of course they did, and there was selfishness, there was greed, there was all the terrible things that go on today going on back then. But again, I think it's very hard for us to fairly judge people because it's almost impossible with our knowledge now to go back to get into the mindset of what they were going on at that particular date. Let's keep going. Penfold 5095. The Germans were famous for their blitzkrieg and motorised divisions, but in reality their logistics used many horses. Did the Allies also rely on horses for their logistics, or were their units motorised? And was this a war winner? After all, as the US General Omar Bradley said, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. That quote, by the way, is actually attributed to a number of people, not just Bradley. I have to say Slim's quite often given that credit for that quote as well. So, did we use horses as well? Yes, we did. Mules were used in Italy, in the Far East campaigns, Burma, etc. But America, in Britain, we had got horses in service, but they were the residue of the cavalry units for transporting the soldier on the back into battle and sometimes fighting from. You know, I had the pleasure when I first started at the Tank Museum with a guy called Ron Huggins, who was a veteran who would come along and volunteer a lot. Wonderful fellow, talked to everybody with his wonderful, charming smile. And when he went to join up, he was in a yeomanry unit and he was issued a sword that he was issued with in 39 still. So that idea of the horse, you know, and he was on horseback. But that quickly goes. We do have, you know, and again, this, careful what you always say, there's always an exception to the rule. Think of the Soviets still had cavalry, and they did have, of course, horse-drawn transport for it. But with Lend-Lease, luckily all those Studebaker trucks start coming. So even though you will see horses there on the Soviet side in the war, they're less and less as the war progresses that way. Oi, what are you doing? But certainly for the Western Allies, unless it was the circumstances such as a hilly terrain in Italy, no, we didn't. But one thing, I think it's slightly different to logistics, but I always find this. I got the book out a little bit earlier on. Here we go. I found the quote in here because this idea about where the horse fitted. In Britain, we have a view of the cavalry not wanting to mechanise in the 20s and 30s. That lovely quote, what was it? I used to love and ride away, but now I screw and bolt. You know, this idea of all the panache of the cavalry, the love of the horse, was going to be difficult to say goodbye to for a cavalry regiment and mechanise, whether it was going to be in armoured cars or later on tanks and track vehicles and that way. What surprised me was how strong, or even stronger, that feeling was within the US Army in that interwar period. And I just want to, here's a quote for you, and just guess when this was said by Major General J.K. Herr, H-E-R-R, who was the chief of the cavalry in the US Army. He said, when he's writing to George C. Marshall, who's basically head of the US military forces, I am well aware of the known hostility of the commanding general field forces to horse cavalry. Nevertheless, in the interests of national defence in this crisis, I urge upon you the necessity, I apologise, I urge on you the necessity of an immediate increase in horse cavalry. So when do you think he actually wrote that to Marshall? It was actually in 1942. And ironically, there's us, thinking of American mechanisation, the power behind it, of industrialisation, the Ford factories, the motorisation of, the American economy, etc., etc. But to hear that being stated by a senior American figure at that date, I personally don't think you would have found a British one saying the same, because I think their love of the horse was always there. But they've had to say goodbye to it, and they know that in terms of practicality because of the society around it. But another great, amazing story to find out. But yes, and even today, exceptions for the rule, there was times in Afghanistan where I think one unit ended up finding that getting a horse was getting them to places better in terms of patrols, etc., and probably therefore also the supplies they took with them. But that's the issue really. World War II, this big difference that with American industrial might, we say it time and time again, whether that's in the armour, whether that's in supply vehicles, all sorts of that huge production that can help support the Western Allies and equally the Soviet Union as well, is what means that the horse doesn't have a sensible role apart from in one or two other circumstances. Right, let's keep going. Two dudes talking. When will you finally visit your Belgian friends in the Royal Military Museum in Brussels? I've got a battlefield tour coming up, taking some mates and things in May. So I'm just wondering, we might be able to head your way sometimes, perhaps in May this year. So thank you for the reminding me. I did promise I'd pop in and say hello. Kiwi27, is there any news on the search for Mother? They've got a website, have a look, just so if those of you who don't know the background, there is a long-going story, rumour, and some little bits of evidence here and there, that Mother in after the First World War, when a number of those tanks, some of them became part of the museum collection, with the Second World War, and earlier, some had been gone beyond the phrase we used, I think it was economic repair. They rusted away to almost nothing. So certain things were scrapped. There was a scrap drives in World War II, but certain things apparently were hidden because the people who was looking after the collection in 39 onwards, they said, no, come on, this is not going to make a great difference to the war effort, but historically is really important. Now, Mother was supposedly buried. The first rhomboid tank prototype, as it were, after Little Willie survives. It was used, we think, as a pillbox at one point. Mother doesn't. Mother disappears. But there's lots of stories about it being buried. And a group have gone out their way to really try and pin down, and they were doing LiDAR scanning on one or two of the areas down on the Bovington Ranges. Have a look at their website. They're updating. The last thing, they did some LiDAR scans. They were given permission. They're fundraising to help them do that. So if you are interested in this, have a look at their site. Try and support them that way, because that is one of those stories. Wouldn't that be quite amazing if certain things like that come out the ground? But the last I'd heard, if I'm honest, there was absolutely nothing certain. But equally, I don't think there was that's it, not worth carrying on moment at all either. Leslie Stevenson, 5261, bit of a what if. Let's say we hadn't had Lend-Lease with the slightly chaotic British method of tank building. What do you reckon the British Army would have come up with, especially in answer to the Panzer IV? Again, yes, the problem of what if. My gut feeling is, my broad brush take is, don't forget, Britain in 1940, we got very good tanks, think Matilda too, but we concentrate our industrial effort on aeroplanes for the very important strategic reasons. Aeroplanes, ships, tanks last, because the aeroplanes and the ship were going to keep us surviving in the war, being an island. We had this enormous potential backing of the empire, which we can sometimes forget, and certain modern historians, David Edgerton, a number of them, economic historians as well, have been pointing out this fact, which is why sometimes there seems to be a confidence. We think it's plucky little Britain. Well, actually, it's plucky little Britain. And people like Churchill, he purposely made our situation look worse at times in some of his speeches, because he was trying to get people to wake up to the fact this is a real situation going on. I mentioned earlier, sometimes you overemphasize things to do that. But he also was very aware that we did have an enormous resource behind us, with Canada, with Australia, with the Empire, with gold reserves, with all sorts of other things, that we would probably get there. And if we can survive that early period in the war, you know, let alone the fact that, of course, then America comes in with all its enormous resource. So my gut feelings, I'm not, if I'm answering this as a question there. So my gut feeling is, I think we would have pretty much done similar things in terms of priorities, given our best thoughts, our best efforts, etc., to the aircraft industry, because that allowed us to defend Britain, as I often say, fighters to fend off the Luftwaffe, then bombers to get back at Germany and start, you know, taking the war back to them, whilst other things were developing. And so we took our foot off the tank bit because we had other pressures and other uses for those resources. And later, when we come into play again, this, you know, common story of British tanks always being abysmal, it's just not there, is it, when you look at the evidence? Because the Comet is a very effective tank. And of course, you know, as we often say, the Centurion, which is really a Second World War design, becomes the best tank for the next decade or so. So that doesn't really answer it. We would have done something, but the good news for Britain was the fact that there was a gap filler. So in other words, we would have probably not had that gap filler, which was the Sherman, of course, from America. We would have had to just wait. And what that meant in terms of land battle, here we are, we're back into this, you know, what ifs all the time, which could go in so many directions. Yeah, it was, as I keep saying, is when you look at it, you kind of think, well, okay, we're not necessarily going to be brilliant at everything in that way in the Second World War stuff. You okay down there? Right, let's keep going. Andy, here we go. Andy's models and stuff. First, thank you for answering my tanks at Crete question in a previous video. I have another question which might just be blown off as a myth, but do you think the Char 2C Champagne survived the end of the war and still exists in Kabinka? Also, are there any other famous tank myths you'd like to know the answer to? Well, other tank myths, Mother, we just talked about, that's a classic one. Wouldn't it be nice to know the end of that story? But if you don't know this story, the FCM Char 2C, that enormous great vehicle with, I think it was a 12-man crew, quite often 13-man, but so often the battalion commander was photographed with it, or the unit commander, so it looked like there were 13 guys about to go inside these things. Designed, shipyard design in the First World War. It was kind of the land battleship type concept, this enormous great thing. I can't remember the tonnage, was it? I wrote it down somewhere. I was talking about this somewhere else. Huge, great big thing, and not many are made. A few are made after the First World War, but they are used for propaganda purposes. And there is a background thought that actually when the Germans, like, you know, France had the Char 2C, Britain comes up with the Independent, that gets coverage. And the Soviets like the look of this, so they build their own versions of the land battleship multi-turreted concept out in the Soviet Union. The Germans probably think, oh, hang on a second, if everyone else has got something, we better have a think about having something in service. And some of that design work, of course, then leads on to, ultimately is picked on by Henschel, and they use it in their design for their Tiger. So these tanks, even though they have pretty awful histories, the Soviet ones don't perform very well. They're not built in large numbers, but some are used in the Finnish War. Independent never goes into production. It's just there as a concept idea to have a thought about. The French Char 2Cs are very vulnerable from the point of view they They need special carriages to move them around, fuel supplies and everything. And of course, certain bridge wouldn't take them. I think they're just under 80 tons. Enormous weight these things are. So when the Germans invade, there is this awkward moving of them, and then the French decide we are going to set fire to them. One of them, rather than see them captured, because they've been such a propaganda thing in some of the French newsreels in the build-up to the war, knocking down old forts and being shown off as this, super weapon. So they didn't want to see them captured, so they end up destroying them on this railway line or railway. Some of them are still on the carriages there. One of them doesn't really catch fire properly, etc. It's taken to Berlin, and the belief is the Soviets picked it up and took it to the Soviet Union. So with so many of these things where the Soviets grabbed stuff in Europe for different reasons, some stuff popped out later and has been returned. So for example, the Soviets captured the Belgian army records that the Germans had taken in Brussels, taken back to Berlin. And, some years ago, most of those ended up being sent back to Brussels. So that kind of opened up a bit. My gut feeling is I don't think there's any hidden sheds somewhere full of this generation of captured material. There's all the modern stuff that's obviously being captured out in places like Ukraine, that's being taken back for showing off propaganda, sometimes for evaluation. But that generation, my gut feeling is we'd know about it by now. So whether there's bits of it rusting at the back of some Soviet scrapyard, but because there's so many tank enthusiasts all around the world now, I think by now someone would have been having a rummage and found out that. So this idea that there's some special store somewhere with all these amazing gems. I don't think the Soviets in that period since World War II, we've gone through so many different changes there that I don't see there's any reason why they would want to keep something like that. Everything else is being shown off at Kablinka. They're kind of, what was their big museum that's moved a bit now. So anyway, let's carry on. Andrew, 666. Do you have any plans to write an autobiography? Your talks, both at the Tank Museum and now your own channel, are fascinating. And I, for one, would be interested in finding out more about you, how your interest developed and insights into life at the Tank Museum and the other roles you've had. So what do I say as I shift in my seat on this one? No, I haven't got any plans. I do feel, here we are, and I have to play this one carefully because I don't want to sound too self-depreciating, but that big worry of arrogance, for goodness sake, who really gives a monkeys about what you think or do or whatever. My background in terms of this stuff is because it was my job at the Tank Museum to try and tell those stories, and that's what got me there. And us as a Tank Museum, we were relatively early in the game on social media as a museum, and now you'll know this, everyone's got their own channel, everyone does their own thing and everything else, and I do find this slightly cringe making in some areas, as no doubt you do. This idea that I've had it. I see the thing. Someone came up to me and said, "Where did those wellies you wear in the back garden? What ones are they? Where do I get those ones?" And you realise actually sometimes we all learn from others. We all want to know. In our different. I'm a boring English bloke of a certain age. There's other boring English blokes out there of a certain age, and why do we all end up with a wax jacket on and a flat cap and something? It's because we've seen other people and we fit this, or we think that's right for us, or it helps identify. I always joked about having corduroy on and a beard being the curator, because that's what people expected a curator to be. It wasn't definite that way, but boy did it meet the role. And I always said, I've said lines in the past, like if a widow was coming to the Tank Museum with husband's medals, they wanted the right type of person to hand those medals over to. And we all make value judgments about how people look, you know all this. Anyway, so some of those things, but I found it a bit squirmy if someone starts talking about things, because my job was to get across the stories that I was representing there. Now I'm able to talk about some stories, and people obviously, you see in the comments, "Oh, stop talking about the bleeding dog, I want to know about this," or "Hang on, you've gone off track here." But at the same time, I also know that because I bump into people all over the place, isn't it lovely when we all go, like I did the one on the war movie album, and so many people say, I had that, and we want to talk about it because it's like shared experience. And equally as well, where sometimes, have you read this or have you seen that view? And that to me is part of the pleasure of life, is where we've got common interests, or we can go to places that we perhaps didn't go to. And one of the things, and you'll know this as well, again, and you'll see it in our comments, thank you so much, because the vast majority of people who put comments on the videos I've had the privilege of doing and sharing, as it were, they're all really sensible, nice comments. But it doesn't take a moment or two for everyone to think, because that's the way the internet works, doesn't it? It riles us up, it gets us angry about things. But this idea that the next moment everyone's having to go at each other about trivia. So, well done, this audience. I was saying this the right way around, but, because it is nice to see, and people have commented that everybody seems to make very grown-ups, and they're the positive. And to me, that's the great thing about social media in its best form, as opposed to, you'll know it, all these videos that just seem to be winding you up, or AI generated rubbish, and no doubt it'll get better, but this idea, and I'm thinking like, hang on a second, the computer voice and all those things. But again, lots of people there. But I also am very much aware as well that, and I have said this before, that me and you might know this, but also one of the people that's watching doesn't know that yet, hasn't necessarily got those other viewpoints coming into their lives yet. So they're learning all the time, and there's always another generation coming to this. So hence why we repeat subjects sometimes, in our lives, don't we? Because we go, oh God, I've done that one to death. We know all about Michael Wittmann. We know all about how good or bad the Tiger was, or something, But then the guys, I was 14 once as well, as I often say, made the model, did whatever, So you want to know that, and another generation comes along. So where am I going with all this? So what I'm trying to say is, I find it embarrassing to talk about certain things. I say the word embarrassing, it sounds like an arrogance. At the same time, if there are things we can all discover and share, or somebody does want to know, where do you buy those wellies, or of course, well, as if like I don't talk about this. Yeah, of course we should share all these things if we can take it in the right way. It's just I worry in case someone thinks, or even worse, thinks, because there's so many better people out there that can talk on the question on naval history than me. But should that stop me from even pointing that way, or sharing an interest, or pointing at something? I just go back to that thing about how the internet can be good. For my sins, I was helping as a trustee on a little chapel that was being restored, and I won't go into all this business and everything else, but anyway, long short of it, they did a Christmas video, and it contains a beautiful piece of music that they recorded. I say they, one of the people that helps there and everything. It's just staggering. And I mention this because it's where on the internet, and I hope you've had that sensation where there's dross, there's trivia, there's things that seem to be baiting you and winding you up, and then suddenly something comes along and you go, good grief, I really didn't know that, or that's introduced me. I was introduced to a piece of bark that, I'd say this, get around the right way, Thomas Tallis. It was this piece of music, I thought I'd listened to some of this music before, and then suddenly when a new piece comes out and grabs you, or, as you'll be aware as well, there's some favourite, I grew up with my sister's 60s records, and suddenly there's better footage of them singing something, and you fall in love again with that, whoever she was, or something singing, whatever. All these things that are really good ones there. And this, I'll put the link down there, just see what you think, because it's a local carol that was sung back by Methodists quite some time ago. And it just was everything about it just made me go, good grief, isn't that lovely? And that's what I hope the best of the internet can do, is it can make people suddenly go, I didn't know that, in a good way. And the connections that people make afterwards, which is good grief, and I've seen some of those veterans comments, or, I served then, or my dad served. Anyone out there know, have you looked at this? So that great way it can bring things together. And I'm also conscious as well, going back to your question, I grew up in just a, the pre-computer era, the first computer came in just as I was leaving school. But I also think as well that idea of knowing what it was like before we all had mobile phones, before we had the internet that way, to give judgment. So many younger people, they don't know that difference, which, that's the life they're going to have to live and lead. But what can we bring as comment on that? Where is the benefits we see from these things? But how is it? How can we have time to read books if everyone's just scrolling on their phones? Or I find myself doing it. Suddenly you're on YouTube and there's me saying, I don't want, and the next minute I'm watching these dogs being rescued and I'm quietly blubbing, whatever about what's going on there. So anyway, I throw that one back to you lot, because there's times where you're not interested in somebody else's who's drifting off into why he likes Victorian semi-naked ladies and Burne-Jones knights in armour or something or other. But at the same time, so I introduced, for me it was the core stuff was about armour and everything. But this is and of course, if you don't like it, you don't have to write an essay. You just don't watch the damn stuff, do you? But this idea, you've got all this wrong, you don't talk about this boring stuff, or shut up about your bloody dog or something, calm down. You can have that opinion, but do it in a different way. We don't all have to vent our spleen every time when these things happen. And I know I'm an enormous hypocrite here, because no doubt I'll vent my spleen in a minute about something. So no autobiography, but I'm quite happy to talk about things if people want it. But I apologise if people don't want to know, all these other areas that aren't just about military or armoured vehicles. Magician's Apprentice, number one question. What small arms did tanks crews have, and did they have any specific evade and escape training, especially in the desert where they had to find water, etc.? Two different things. So, personal weapons mainly. So what's the personal weapon? It's one that they would carry sometimes away from the vehicle. So hence, pistols were issued to not all, but some of the tank crew. Officer always had one. The idea as well that there would be secondary armament, so the armament, some was removable to take away from the vehicle, but sometimes not. So whether you had a Sten gun or a Bren gun or other items carried within the vehicle, so that when you are going away from the vehicle on foot, and that could be for a whole host of reasons in areas that might only just been captured. Are the enemy still around? Are you going off on a recce to see if this routes, So you had personal weapons that way. There is this desire to have as small as possible but as effective. So when Britain took on the SA-80, they actually did a carbine version for vehicle crews, and it's barely, only a few inches shorter, I think, sort of thing. But it always made me laugh, that one. Because you think for the amount of effort to just say that, why didn't they go and get a Heckler and Koch or something else that was already out there? So, yes, you can see why you need as a small arms. And there is also, of course, on a lot of vehicles, look at a First World War tank, pistol ports, so that because there was angles where they knew an enemy could approach a vehicle, so you could turn this, what's like a disc of metal on a bolt, turn it, put your pistol out and shoot at the enemy in angles your main armament or your secondary armament couldn't get to. And the Tiger's got that. Don't forget it had pistol ports on the side of the turret, as did a number of other vehicles that way at different times, because of that worry about infantry getting close in. They might be climbing up, putting the satchel charge or petrol bomb on you or something that way. So there was other reasons other than just when you went away from the vehicle. In terms of, and again, look at all the pictures, because of course there's then what did people get hold of, so what you were issued with, but also, I've got one of these, and how long does that last? Can you get the ammunition for it? All the problems of the souvenir or the captured weapon as well. Did they have special training? Funny enough, I was trying to recall that. I don't think I've read any memoirs, certainly for British tank crews, etc., in North Africa, of special training. They were taught about, you've got to conserve water, you try and do it this way. Don't always, what would happen if the rear echelon or B echelon coming up to resupply you doesn't make it through? What are those things? How do we stretch things? Because supplies at certain time, there's great issues, about morale and tea and everything else. So all of these sorts of things, but I don't remember them having specific training. That tended to be for pilots or specialist crews that knew they had a higher risk of losing out if they are knocked out or abandoned. But look at some, again, I always remember some of those photographs of these guys who've come back across the desert. I can't remember if it was a Blenheim or Wellington crew, you know, beards. They've got to manage to get a bit of wood to carry a couple of water cans between them as they've been legging it, I think 6 weeks. You know, they're just amazing stories. And how the wheres and the why-fors, if people are left behind, you know, and what you're relying on and what you think is the best thing to do. But survival in some of those circumstances, you know, how the hell, it was just almost, yeah, I don't know how if you thought you were suddenly, imagine that sensation of suddenly realising there's been a battle, everyone's disappeared. Now what? You've been left behind, you might have been clonked on the head or whatever, and you're waking up thinking, which direction do I head in? Do I give myself up? How long am I going to last? You know, desert nights, freezing cold. That's the irony why you see them all in these big coats and you're thinking, he's out in the desert in a jeep. Another fascinating topic area. So let's carry on. I've just taken Finn out for a little bit of a walk, so hopefully he's happier now. But let's keep going. Right, Gary Nelson, 1833. My question is, was Corner camouflage effective? Now, I've already talked a little bit about camouflage. The Corner scheme, for those who don't know it, there was a chap, Corner served in the First World War. He was an amateur artist. He went on, he joined the Royal Tank Corps. He was serving out in North Africa with a tank regiment in the Second World War. And he came up with a camouflage scheme that uses a set number of colours that were officially approved. This wasn't just an amateur having a go, you know, there was tests were done. And he's basing it, certain ideas as early as the First World War. Tudor Hart in the First World War was using sort of like faceted patterns as a way of disrupting the shape of certain items. And what happens with Corner is he comes up, and you can only really describe it as like splinters of colour across vehicles were done, and they seem to be effective enough. What, as I was saying before, is a real problem is there doesn't seem to be a standard set of tests for camouflage. And I was thinking about this, you know, because again, even when we were involved at the Tank Museum with putting a digital camouflage scheme, and it was being compared to certain other types of camouflage, and we took certain vehicles up to the Army's training area, one of the ways that was this good or bad was literally just getting 10 new recruits were standing there and were asked for a set period of time, look at this landscape, how quickly can you find the tank that was hidden in it? And you know, that idea of as a test, is this one more effective because it takes them longer? So this idea of what's an effective camouflage, and of course today one of the issues is we're talking about, so often we talk about camouflage for the human eye, I can't see, or this is help disrupt the outline, or I can't work out, is it going this way or that way? You know, what's that? Of course, nowadays there's going to be all these other ways of camouflaging things because of infrared, drones seeing things from different angles that we're used to seeing things from ground level. All sorts of other elements are going to come into, whether it's thermal, other ways of trying to hide and camouflage, whether it's your heat signature rather than just what something looks like to the human eye. Now the Corner scheme, so why I say that is it's just very hard to find a standard of judgment that you can equate. And the other issue is at different times, obviously certain schemes seem to work in certain parts of the world, and other schemes as well, it's time of day. So landscape, time of day, it may look ridiculous at the middle of the day, but at the end of the day or the beginning of the day when the light's low, this may have a greater effect. So really the question there, what you're saying, was it effective? Undoubtedly it must have had an effect because they kept on doing it to a cost and time and energy. Although on the other hand, what I always have to balance these things is sometimes doing something can be better than nothing, but also from the point of view of morale. So don't forget, we allow people to do certain things where, you know, like tank track on the front of a tank, it might have done very little difference to the level of protection. There was obviously something else there, but actually it made the guys inside feel better. So Montgomery famously said, look, let them do it, even though he knew it was slowing down the tank a bit and it had sort of detrimental effects as well. So, you know, again, with camouflage, okay, I've made the effort. It may not be a great effort, you know, it may not make a huge amount of difference to whether I can be seen or not, but it makes me feel good, better because something's been done rather than nothing there. So, yeah, as I say, unless somebody else can correct me, but I just don't see as, you know, at certain times we have certain types of tests for camouflage and one might appear better, but it's not like there's a test that's done across time that we can therefore say this was as good as or better than something else that was going on that way. Moving on, Smoker Jim, do you have any other interests or knowledge that you'd like to bring to the channel, either offering a choice of subjects to Patreon supporters, and he mentions one that does one there, or short series of videos over a period of time. And again, there's another examples. You're well known for your knowledge on armoured vehicles in World War II, but is there any other passion you like to educate and entertain us with? Thank you very much, and I at least am looking forward to the knowledge that you and Finn share in the new year. So, as I was saying, so here we go. This is, I was mentioning it earlier on, this is a tricky bit for me because I gave the title David Willey Waffles On, and boy do I waffle, as you've understood that way, but it's where do we go in terms of what bringing in. So my interest in, for example, you know, I used to look after fine art. I got a great passion for Sir Edward Burne-Jones. I love his beautiful pencil drawing. I love his colouring and his oil paintings. I love, you know, his knights in armour, and I love his beautiful ladies, you know, all just as all those sorts of things. Am I the person to present that, or are there better people for doing that type of thing? At the same time, if I've caught your attention on something, can I be a conduit to get you into another area? So how do we all learn if, you know, we only stick to one area? All those other people, as I've mentioned, you know, the benefits of the internet and the clever way it works, that sometimes throws up things in front of us that really do make us go, oh, I didn't know that, and that's interesting, isn't it? And we might go and find further more, or we might be just satisfied with that. Thank you, that was enough to know about those sort of topics and things. So, again, as I was saying a little bit earlier on, I'd almost put that one back out to you, because if people there are interested in that, I know, I keep saying it, I don't want to wind you all up by talking about things that someone's going, you know, like I don't want to be here for that type of thing. You don't have to be, all right, you know, you can go and watch something else that way. I hate to lose people who like watching this just because of one or two issues that way, but at the same time, I'd like to think that though my interests I've been talking about here is, you know, stemming from what I had to do at the Tank Museum, which was part of the job, and that's how you get, but the fact you can bring in other things, as you have done in your comments, and have you thought of this, or did you read that, or have you looked at this bit, but those enthusiasms in life, and again I come back to that brilliant bit of how the internet at its best can have someone present to you about something you knew nothing about, but whether it's because of their art of persuasion, what they actually reveal to you, how it's done, all of those things. I didn't think I was going to be taken with that, but now I am. And that pleasure in life is surely that sense of we're learning new things all the time. And even if it is going back to the comfort of older things as well, but not necessarily in this subject area. So, you know, I come all these bits and pieces that way that I find genuinely I'm taken with, and I would love to be able to pass on. Or things that in passing, as I'm saying as well just now, things that, you know, okay, if somebody does want to know that, can I share it with you? Can I give you something, you know, or steer you in a certain direction if people want that? Without, I hate to say, I'm bound to doing that if somebody thinks they're watching this because they want to know about military all the time, you know, and that, and if he starts talking about something else like Victorian art or Gothic armour or something else that way, it's just like, you know, an anathema. I don't want to go there. And there's bound to be, you know, subjects I just go, oh, for goodness sake, I'm just, you know, however open-minded I want to be, I don't necessarily want to go there, or I've got too much of. And look at the world, I repeat as well about look at the way the world's around us going on at the moment. sometimes is we can debate it and angst about it and look at it to the nth degree. There's other times where, and we all need to be responsible people, we're part of that world, but when's the time also that we want to find other things to take our minds off that, to get a balance, or to look at help us look at those things going on today in a perspective that the past I cannot help but gives us that, and a balance in terms of what's really meaningful in life. So whether it is great literature, great art, other things, nature, the bird life around me, all of these wonderful things, my dog, all of that stuff that helps give a perspective to other things that are going on. And I think, more and more is that going to be important for us. Anyway, so I'm not sure yet again if that's really answered your bit there. But actually, I wrote down a line here that things that we just didn't know about. So we all know about Basil Littleheart and him selling his idea of how he was the guy that came up with, in the interwar period, with Fuller to a degree, but he was trying to say, and he gets people like Guderian to change their memoir to say, oh no, it was me you were reading, wasn't it, that influenced how you did things and everything. Here's a lovely little one of those lines that makes you raise an eyebrow if you didn't know. He collected ladies' fashion, especially ladies' undergarments. When you find out things like that, quite a considerable collection that end up going to a university, your jaw drops, doesn't it? These things that we find out as life goes on. Anyway, Scott Grimwood, 8868. Can you explain the British Army's use of shorts as a combat uniform in World War II? To me, uncovered legs are prone to injury and insect bites. Well, even in your answer there, you kind of got that right, because yes, the British Army in the First World War, we had shorts in the trenches. The idea, whenever you, as you're indicating, kneeling around the place with bare knees, don't you need pads, trousers, anything to protect you a bit? In the Western Desert, shorts seen all over the place. Only when they go to Italy do they start introducing lighter cotton trousers rather than battle dress blouse, which tended to be wool, or battle dress uniform, the trousers there were wool. So they introduced cotton ones because they're starting to go into areas where there's malaria. So Italy, Sicily, etc., there was malarial areas. So mosquito bites are going to be important, just like out in the Far East. So that becomes part of your uniform instruction about covering up at certain times, especially at certain times of day, so you don't get bitten, you don't get malaria, and you don't, therefore, you're no good to that fighting force from that point of view. So again, if you'll see there from the invasion of Sicily onwards, longer trousers are being issued in a lighter cotton, just as they've done lighter cotton shorts and things. Yeah, so I know the feeling. You see these guys running around, you think the minute they're going to have to hit the dirt, those, like when we were kids and falling over in the playground and stuff, with the state of your knees become. We hear a lot, this is from Chickmunk 6276, we hear a lot about Bergpanzers, but not a lot about the Allies' use of German tanks. I'm currently building a model of the Panther Cuckoo as used by the Coldstream Guards. Do you know any more noticeable examples? Well, Chipmunk 6276, I hope I don't embarrass you here, but you've used the phrase Bergpanther, which is a recovery tank. I think you meant to use the phrase Beutpanzer, which is basically the German word for using the captured tanks that they put back into service, if you're talking about things like the Panther Cuckoo, which was done by the British. So why is it that we don't hear more on the Allied side? Well, they do. Soviets, for example, they capture over 100, I think it is, Panzer III variants and some Sturmgeschützes at Stalingrad. They rebuild them to a different spec and they go back into service. You'll see the Germans are most famous for this because, again, they have a lack of their own resource. So there is a much greater tendency in the German military to reissue, sometimes to alter, then reissue captured equipment. And they've got a lot of it, don't forget, of course, because after the invasion of Holland, Belgium, France, they've got British captured equipment from 1940, they've got Polish, they've got that enormous Czech arms industry they've taken over. So about a third of the German tank force is equipped with Czech tanks when it invades France in 1940. So there's reasonings obviously there. But us to say, oh, well, we didn't, on the Western Allies, we didn't. Yes, the Soviets might have used captured equipment more. We did. So, for example, in North Africa, it was when it was needed. So there's at least about 60 captured Italian tanks are being used in about March of 1941, I think it is, where there's only about 300 and something odd British tanks, listed, and about 60 of those. I actually wrote the figures down because I remember thinking how interesting that was. Here we are, it's early in 41. 365 British tanks are actually listed on the census returns, 60 of which are captured Italian medium tanks, things like the M16 or M13 things, and they're issued to 6 RTR. And again, that's because they really needed them and they got a number of them. The other side of that story, though, is in terms of armoured vehicles that you're talking about there, Bergpanzers, why didn't we do it? Well, obviously the answer there is because we didn't have the pressure on us to in the same way that the American supply of the Sherman meant it was much easier to go and get one when they do capture. So you've mentioned Cuckoo, which is Guards used. There's another one that was being out-used, captured by the Canadians in Italy, handed over to an RAC regiment. They called it Deserter, suitably, and that was used for a period of time. Now, all very good and liked, but no spares to sustain it. So just like Cuckoo, I think, is it that the petrol pump goes in the end and they can't fix it. They've got other issues that come with that. So a Panther won't fit across a normal Bailey Bridge. So you can't always get it to the same place as your own kit, let alone the risk. So there was always that risk of however much you try and paint it, put it in the right place, someone else, imagine that pilot flying over, if he's recognised a Panther, that's a target, okay? So there's a real risk of using forward captured equipment, what it sounds like, same as machine guns and everything. And the need wasn't there in the same way. So that, to me, is the argument why certainly the Western Allies, we did do it, but not that often, because we didn't have to. However lovely it was, they tend to be isolated examples of that tends to happen with. And you're just not going to be able to keep them going. If the Germans, found it hard work keeping Panthers going all that time, imagine when you haven't got the spare parts or the manual or the everything else necessarily to keep something going. But, for a short space of the time, that idea of us, oh no, we never do that. Well, we do, we've captured German artillery, we use it till the ammunition runs out. We have done that. And there's certain circumstances where if it's all you can get hold of, boy, you'll then take that risk. But with armour, it's a much more problematic thing to keep them going. Kingdom Ord, what do you think was the regular British Army's, not paras, not commandos, not special forces, greatest victory of the Second World War? That's a kind of tricky one, and I'd almost throw this one back to you because other people, come back. Do you think of that sort of stuff? Because what's the greatest mean? Is it a small unit action that is just staggering on its own when we find out about it? Because that, what's that greatest victory? Is it just because it's against the odds, or is it what those outcomes lead to? So in that case, I would argue, actually, it's not a great victory in any way, but the British Army at Dunkirk, the fact that with the Navy, they're able to save an army. So, we have defensive troops, everything else with the French as well going on, that army was rescued really against the odds at the time. And you look at everybody thinking, that's it, we've lost here. And then they get it, which means Churchill can continue the fight and not have to negotiate. We've still got the RAF, still got the Navy, but having that army really changed things, being able to rescue that army. We were not, therefore, lacking that third service in 1940, in the summer of 40. So that strategically makes an enormous difference to the war. Imagine if Churchill had to basically come to some arrangement with Hitler in the summer of 1940, how the world might have changed. So it is a tricky one to answer that as a proper question. I always feel sorry for Slim and the soldiers fighting out in the Far East. They tend to get forgotten about, but that idea that they had this tremendous series of defeats, retreats, going all the way back up to India, and then turning round and fighting their way all the way back against the Japanese, quite often with equipment that was basically you were second, third on the list in terms of the theatre of war before stuff got out to you. So because priorities were given to European theatre, you know, things like that, you think, what an achievement, but we still don't really know that much about it, do we? Come on, be honest, unless you love that. So that sense of, to me, that again, what's the victory, what's the greatest, it's also shining light on things that we don't know about. And I come back to it because everything's important in its own way, isn't it? Because some of these smaller little things, we can talk about a big moment, a major campaign or something, but all those little parts of the mosaic add up to the picture. And that's where sometimes, you know, I keep coming back to why the pleasure of diving into these little moments all over the place, what that added to that overall achievement of the defeat of, you know, the fascist nations in World War II type thing, that sort of thing there. But you know, please, that's a classic one of, sometimes it's what takes our fancy, but offer those things up, you know, in the comments and everything. What are those things we should be looking at, or perhaps we've overlooked? And sometimes what are those things when you think about it? It doesn't take too much when someone points out the real significance of that victory. Greatest, tricky word, isn't it? You know, it's like greatest football player and everything. Well, time, resource, the period, who they were playing with, what was going on. You know, it's so many other things go into this as well. Andy's model stuff. I've talked about the Char 2C, so I'm just working my way through here. Is it Stig Fries asks, if a woodchuck could chuck wood, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck wood? Oh, I'm going to say that one again. If a woodchuck could chuck wood, how much would a woodchuck chuck wood? Now, you may not know this, but that actually, tongue twister, comes from a 1902 song that was actually written by a guy called Robert Hobart Davis for a musical, sung in, the musical was called The Runaways, but it was sung by someone called Faye Templeton. And there's these little tongue twisters out in that. I think someone, by the way, a woodchuck for, we don't have them in Britain or whatever, but they're, what are you called, a groundhog, isn't it? Or gophers or something or other, you know, they bit like a beaver, chew away at wood sometimes. So someone's done the calculation of what a woodchuck could potentially, is it £700 or something? I can't remember what they do in the end, but and I'm not quite sure why you asked me that question anyway, but there we go. Let's go on. Tom Henry, 897, milk before or after pouring tea. An interesting one, because if you like your tea, I used to, when I was a youngster and a student, and I even bought it to show you, I bought this in a junk shop somewhere, and that was my tea caddy. And I used to mix in there loose tea, so it might be, I would put something like just some India or China tea, and then add something like one pack, you know, 2 bits of normal tea to one of something like, sometimes Lapsang Souchong, lovely smoky flavour, or sometimes Earl Grey with that oil of bergamot flavour it's got in there. And I used to do loose tea in a teapot, make the tea that way. Again, like so many people, it sounds awfully lazy, I now use tea bags. And the truth is, because when you make a cup of tea with a tea bag, what I do is, of course, you walk away for it as it's stewing for a little bit, and you do other things. Sometimes I forget everything, which is why I add the milk after I've made the tea, because then it depends on how strong it is, so that, you know, if it's been a weak cup, you don't add whatever. If it's stronger, I might add a little bit more milk if I've accidentally left it that long to stew for a bit much longer. But I would say, and here's one of those things that some of you are very much aware of, I wasn't till fairly recently, but most in Britain, most of us are used to tea bags that are made of paper. And that means the tea bag goes, the whole thing is biodegradable. I know, and again, I've seen it myself, you know, you go in certain hotels or you go to certain parts of the world and they have a little piece of paper, a string, and then the tea bag is made, if you look at it, it's made of plastic. And that is just not good for so many different reasons. Number one is we don't really know the end results, but we're ingesting some of that plastic, microplastics there in that tea bag. It's not biodegradable, so when it's thrown out, that's plastics going in the ground, and plastics everywhere, as we all know. And also another thing, which I'm not so sure, and this is interesting, where what goes into tea bags, when you used to have loose tea, you could see it. You could see the different types of tea, and it was very there. So often with, especially very, very cheap tea bags and everything, it could be the floor sweepings. It all just looked like dusts that were being used. Now, there's probably a good reason why it needs to be smaller in a tea bag. But at the same time, you know, so I'm, you know, even though I sound a real hypocrite, I don't use loose tea that much, and I don't bother making a teapot. But it's a shame in a way. But just back to the general point about tea. Tea for me, this is one of those debates that we have sometimes. There's a load of us on a battlefield tour, or we're camping somewhere. We all like our drink and everything, but at the same time, if you had to put alcohol versus tea, I still think it is very, very hard to think of anything as a fluid that's better than that first cup of tea of the day. For me, it's normally a pint of tea. I do like coffee. I have my coffee cup later on, but tea has got something about it. And again, as I've talked in some of these videos and things before, you know, you think about the war years and why tea was great for morale. It calmed you down. It made you go through a process. It gave you a familiarity that registered to wherever you were in the world, whatever you were doing. It's something that happened back at home. And it was practically good as well, which is why the British Army in North Africa had way lower dysentery rates than the German Africa Corps, because we boiled our water, that killed the bugs to make teas. The Germans didn't do that as much. So our guys were fitter that way. And the morale factor that tea brought, you know, is still there to this day. You see it, however awful and everything, you know, you see these emergencies, these terrible things happening and whatever. I can't remember the one I remember seeing, and suddenly, boom. What was the one? It really got me, because suddenly there was just this, I think it was the locals Women's Institute, whatever the tray, they suddenly, within seconds, they were there with a tray full of tea for all the emergency workers or something. And you just sort of, what it gives people, a nice warm hot drink, and tea seems to do it. You know, it's just at well, you mind this subject, because I repeat myself, there's so much you can talk about tea and drink, and it's important, let alone, as someone else mentioned, you know, things like the boiling vessel and everything. But there we are, that was my tea caddy there. Bill Evans 7936, could you discuss pink camouflage? So I've just been talking about camouflage, but so why pink? There was, again, pink was looked at. It was painted on Spitfires for reconnaissance in the Second World War. Parts of the world, times of the day, pink looked fantastic against sunsets or whatever, or I say looked to get blended with early in the morning and later. So it seemed to work very well that way. Mountbatten in the Navy, there was something called Mountbatten Pink, which doesn't look very pink to most of us, but he'd seen an ocean liner that had got a pink finish on it disappear against the horizon at a certain time of the day. So he encouraged the use of this certain colour pink that was put on one or two naval ships, and it is, as I say, it's that real problem we've all got, that there's no definite standard for the effectiveness of camouflage. And at certain times of the day, that's going to really work. Other times it may not. But certainly with the desert, it seems to be that pink was a much better finish than you can imagine things like olive drab and things that vehicles were finished in. And on that score, one of the most famous use of the colour pink was on Land Rovers used by the Special Forces, SAS, in the post-war period, 50s, 60s, 70s. I think they stopped doing it about 91. I think it went over to that stone colour and then. But because of that pink colour, especially for the Middle East theatres, the Land Rovers became known as Pink Panthers or Pinkies. And again, you'll see these accounts where younger SS guys were coming along, you know, in the later 90s, early 2000s, saying, why are you calling these vehicles Pinkies? and it was because the name stuck, and they dated back, even though they're not pink anymore that way. Yes, the evidence is there that the pink does work as a camouflage. People were doing it. How much that works, as I keep saying, is it's very hard, because at a certain place, a certain time of day, this may be the best thing ever. Other times of the day, would a different camouflage scheme be better? We just don't, can't do all those 101 experiments, and there doesn't seem to be a completely level playing field about what that effect does. Like, how do we judge it in a way, giving it points out of 10 or something? So it's really, really just hard to do that way. On to, right, Mark Ryan. I've just got back from Africa. He's a guy who's sent a question in when he was driving across the desert, and noticed the film Der Tiger, now streaming. I watched it last night, and in it, the Tiger 1 does not only cross a river, but it stops in the middle of it, deep underwater, switching off its engine. After a while, it restarts and drives out. I'm asking David if that scenario was really possible. Thanks. So, Mark, I've got to play an honest bit here. The producers of that film, they came to the Tank Museum some years back. Frank Cush, lovely guy, came along. People came to measure our tank, our Tiger 131. That was used out in for them to build the replica out in Czechoslovakia. Lovely guys doing all that. And I had a couple of conference calls with the writers, Frank Cush, as well as the writer and director there. And we went through, they sent me the script, a bit like with Fury and everything, and you could comment on, and you saying, listen, what about this, or how about that? I'll be honest, I think with me, I'm not sure if I gave them the right information, whatever, but we drifted into talking about it as a script, because I was comparing some of the, and I don't want to give away the film to people who haven't seen it yet, but what worked in some other films, how my opinion about, especially with the producer Frank Cush, he picked up on the fact I kept saying, they do beautiful replicas and all these movies and everything, but they always get the blooming suspension wrong for nerds like us, if you like that sort of thing. The overall point I would come back to every time, it's a drama, it ain't a documentary. Wouldn't it be nice? We like thinking, you can do a great drama and still get the accuracy and everything. In this case, it was part of the conceit, whatever phrase you want to use, the drama of the movie or whatever. Of course, I made the point, and I'm not the only one. By the way, I'm on at the back. Someone pointed out to me that I am actually mentioned in all the credits and that. But so, not just me, I hasten to add, it wasn't, they went to people like Wolfgang Schneider, and I think the Panzer Museum as well. But anyway, long and short of all that bit was, I could make comment on those things. And I said, look, there's no evidence any Tiger crew ever deep waded in any campaign. It was quite quickly that ability to deep wade was cut from the tank program, because they realised it was, excessive and not being used, or it wouldn't be used. It was too risky anyway, etc. So what happens that I'm sure they could have driven under and turned off the engine, but started it again underwater and everything. You just would never have done that. But that's not me trying to criticise the film that way. I brought those things up when you were talking about this, when we were going through what was in the movie. I was trying to explain things like, actually, again, that conceit, the last tank in the world you probably go out on a rescue mission is a Tiger, isn't it, in one sense? But at the same time, it works for the nature of the story and that sense of the presence tanks have and all those things that go along those ways. So we actually had really interesting conversations there. But I haven't seen the final one. They came back and Frank very kindly gave us a showing of before the final cut, and we watched that at work, to get some of the feedback and comments. I got very charmingly, they sent me an invite to the premiere in Berlin. I won't go on about that, but I didn't in the end go, but I should have probably done that just out of interest. I haven't got Netflix, I haven't seen the whole thing yet, the final product, so I'll be interested. I was very interested because I think it was called Der Tiger in Berlin. Over here I think it's been under a name of Tank or something or other, but I'd be interested because I've actually seen some very interesting reviews that aren't just slagging it off as you'd expect. It's just rubbish, isn't it? These terrible things, or they've got it all factually wrong and everything. So And again, that idea of the German viewpoint of how they're looking at the war and other things coming across. So for me, I hope I will get to see it at some point. You know, that's another one of those. But I'll be also interested to see what other people's comments. But again, I'm just trying to sort of say, going back to some of those earlier points we were making about being all grown-ups, just remember it's not a documentary. So just listing everything they get wrong, you're kind of missing the target, aren't you? You know, does it work as a film? Where are the things that it's a shame that, or maybe that could have been worked better there, sort of thing, rather than just, you know, we're trying to judge onto the wrong criteria if we just go at it as if like, oh, but it's factually completely incorrect, you know. I got more disturbed about the way the guy was wearing his hat the whole damn time, which, you know, that really annoyed me when I first saw it, and I didn't know if it was because they were just worried about straight away showing sort of, you know, the swastika on his cat badge or something. So anyway, yeah, so an interesting one there. Now, I can go on. I know there's lots of questions, so I do apologise if I haven't actually answered your question, but do keep them coming, because we'll try and answer them, perhaps, you know, weave some of them, will be in some of the videos in the future as well. I just repeat again what I was saying earlier on. Thank you so much. Please do subscribe or get people to subscribe. That really helps for all the reasons I don't quite understand and everything. And patrons, I do understand, because obviously you are contributing, which does mean we can buy things like these microphones and perhaps at some point, you know, a new camera or other things to try and make better films. And but suggestions coming in, please do. We've got some other ideas and some things coming along in due course and that, but all I can say is I hope this is a Q&A. We've answered some questions, gone on an awful long time, I know. Finn's so bored he's gone to sleep. Well, he's had his walk and everything anyway, so he's happy. And I repeat, thank you so much, and do please try and continue supporting us. Till next time, bye-bye. This is WG Laidlaw. Good day, David. My apologies if this message is created in the wrong place on the site. I would love to have your suggestions on good books relating to two subjects. One, the career and death of Michael Wittmann, and two, the German Bismarck and Scharnhorst class battleships of World War II. Thank you for any suggestions you may have. From Bill. So, again, those two subjects. Let's start with the first one. I'll be honest, I think there's so much partisan stuff out there on Wittmann. His main big biography was kind of by almost like an apologist for some of the German tank crews and everything else, a guy called Agate. My suggestion to you is, I can't point at one. I think what you have to do is look at the different people's accounts, different attitude. Wolfgang Schneider's made comments when he's done his book Panzers in, or Tigers in Normandy. There's Ken Tout, who wrote from the British point of view at the battle that sees the demise of Michael Wittmann, etc. My only feeling, I would say, there's also one of the Ospreys which takes you through that, which is about Firefly versus Tiger, which covers that Wittmann battle. If you want all the other background stuff, you're going to have to go to some of those other deeper biographies. But in terms of a balanced view, especially about the end battle and everything, this is where I hate to say it, I think you have to read a number of sources and come up with your own conclusion. Because again, there's still big differences. And as we all know, those myths that sometimes were entirely understandable, that were put about at the time, built up, such as the battle at Villers-Bocage, why it became this propaganda success for the Germans, why it affected the Allies in a certain way, when actually underneath it all, you might call the battle more of a draw, but the individual action of Wittmann and his Tiger obviously captured the drama, but then was egged on to a degree, you know, with fake photographs and signal photos joined together to make it look like there was more vehicles knocked out, etc., than there actually were at the time. So this is one of those cases where I think, depending on what you've read where, you will find your own balanced opinion. And there's not one individual one that I would say to you, you really need to sort of read that. Yeah, you know, and again, look as well. I think there's very good reviews sometimes on some of the websites. So if you go on, even if you're buying a book from Amazon, I've mentioned this before, look at the reviews below. Yes, there's all those ones that are just meaningless to you as trying to find out about the book, but then you'll find there's people who bothered to spend time giving what I would like to think of as a balanced review or fair criticisms, and that's where you start registering names, the reviews, the numbers of them, who's making comment, is it just a pat on his back by his mate trying to help him sell more books, or is it actually a bit more of an analysis by someone who knows the subject area and is saying where this book fits within it. And that's a reason, you know, so you might want to read those extremes of the different views, because it helps you understand what all the debate comes from, and, you know, whether or not, and I've said it before, I had the great the pleasure of meeting Otto Carius once, and he famously, he said, you know, with all this palaver, we were having a conversation, but he just shrugged his shoulders and said all this stuff about how many tanks we all knocked out. Number one, he said, if I've got a good gun and I was in a great tank, it wasn't me that shot those other, I had to position the tank, that was my art. And the other point he made, he just said, if you add all these tanks, these numbers sometimes, you know, this way, the propaganda, just as Britain did in 1940, you know, the Battle of Britain, there was reasons why it was being done, but the number of planes being shot down, etc., the Luftwaffe, it was over-egged. And some of that time, you understand why, for propaganda, morale, all sorts of reasons, keeping people going that way. But but at the same time, when you're looking at all these things, all right, okay, just enjoy yourself. Don't worry about it all. I come back to, I just think you've just got to understand that where those stories are coming from, and some of that is by reading the backgrounds of who the author is, because from the military unit, sometimes post the event, trying to lay claim to things, and sometimes, you know, for political reasons, sometimes because we just want to redress a balance. So sometimes I do it all the time. I probably go too far the other way to make counter arguments when you've got this either, oh, weren't we all great or something, were we? Or vice versa. If someone slags us off all the time, come on, is a picture so often much more complex than perhaps we give credit for at the time. Now, the second part of your question, what do we, Bismarck, good books on Bismarck and Scharnhorst, class of battleships in World War II. Well, with all these things, one of the things I always, and it comes up later on as well, it depends what you want to get out of the books, because, you know, I can recommend books on German tanks that are purely technical, and most people, if you come at it thinking it's going to be Tom Jensen, Hilary Doyle, they, you know, did massive amounts of work finding the records, trying to get them in the right order, trying to get things identified. It's my turn to talk. All right? Can we stop it for the minute? All right, no more. So rude. What have I done today? So that sense of just reading the technical and picking that apart, some of us, I personally, I want the first-hand accounts. I wanted to know what it was like to feel like by the person who was there at the time. And that can relate to how they interoperated with a vehicle or something else. And sometimes, you know, it's back to where does this fit in the wider picture? Who made it? Why did they make it? How come it came out that way? So very few books will cover all of those issues. And that's why I always sort of think it depends what you want from that. You know, what's a good book? Well, it might be good for you, but not good for the other person who's got a different area of interest. So I've just picked up, there's a lot of quotes from a book by Heinrich Biedermeier, and it was published in 1997 out on the Scharnhorst, and it's gone into 5 editions, so it sounds pretty good that way. Published in Hamburg. Now, whether there's an English version of that one, but a lot of times people refer to this book, so I'm not sure myself what's on there and all those bits and pieces. Alf Jacobson, 2003, there's a book there by Southern Publishing called Scharnhorst. And I'd also recommend, for me, because I read it, and this is where you go back to the times you read these things, a guy who kind of got the drama of it was a chap that many of you, if you're British, you might know this name, Ludovic Kennedy. Now, Ludovic Kennedy, his father was a Royal Naval captain. His father, actually, at the beginning of World War II, he was put in charge of a P&O crew liner that was converted, was weaponised, you know, so it was basically a sort of merchant ship that guns were put on it called the Rawalpindi. And in 1940, it bumps into, and I say bumps into, the guy, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst are heading off into the North Sea, and they bump into basically the HMS Rawalpindi, this liner, which has got no chance in terms of its firepower. It's a little bit of speed there and everything, but nothing like to be able to get to have a chance against these German pocket battleships or cruisers. And yet, what does the captain do? He manages, so number one, he managed to get the radio message through that this is the location of those 2 ships, which was so important to the Admiralty to be able to try and counter it. And the other thing that happens is he then, completely against all what you might call logic, but for a naval officer, especially at the Royal Naval, we're going to attack. And they actually go towards, not try and get away from, these 2 German battle cruisers. Now, the Rawalpindi is sunk. He is commended for his bravery, even though he loses life, as does many of the crew. But just again, one of those gobsmacking naval stories, which is what comes out in Ludovic Kennedy, his son, who ends up on a destroyer. I think it's HMS Tartar, I think he was on. I thought I wrote it down somewhere. Yeah, HMS Tartar. And Ludovic Kennedy is a young officer who sees the end of the Bismarck. And that book I'd strongly recommend because it gives some of that drama of naval warfare, and at the same time the numbing cold, the conditions and everything else comes across that way. And he's there. It's called Pursuit, and it was published way back in the 90s, I think it was, that he did it. 1974, I think, the first time he came out. And Kennedy became quite a famous figure in the media. He interviewed people, he made documentaries, and he married, and here you go, hope for us all, 1949, he goes to a party and he's introduced to Moira Shearer, who's the young lass with red hair who appears, the dancer, goes on to be a big star, but she's a dancer that was in the Red Shoes. And again, I know I go off tangent here, but some of you like this, I hope you do, because look at, if you want to get into film, we're so used to inundated with a Hollywood view of film, which is why I always recommend go and have a look at other nations, how their film traditions are. But in terms of imagination, the use of colour, just staggeringly good films. Powell and Pressburger's films, and one of those is this famous one, The Red Shoes, where they have Moira Shearer as the dancer. Ludovic Kennedy goes and asks her to dance. She says, I'm not a very good dancer at this where he meets her for the first time. Sums up his courage, he's going to go over, thinks she looks amazing. And she's honest, because ironically, she's a ballet dancer, doesn't really know how to do the sort of ballroom or the equivalent dance of the time. But anyway, they marry and have a very long and happy life together. And he becomes a television personality, all sorts of things later on. But I come back to, so read that book, Pursuit. And you've touched on a subject here, which for me, again, is when are we going to have all the time? I'm sitting in front of some of my books. I'll touch on that again. But it's that awful feeling of there's so much to read, so much to learn, so much good stuff out there, whether it's the history, whether it's a memoir, whether it's just literature in general. And that's what slightly frightens me. I'm not going to get to do it all. But the naval war is another whole area that's so interesting when you scratch the surface. You know, you start looking into it. And so moving as well. And one of the ones that used to stick, it took my breath away, like just these odd lines there. They were talking, this chap was doing accounts of what happened on some of the convoys that were going from Britain, trying to get supplies through to Russia. The loss rate there at certain times, let alone the conditions. You know, you see the pictures in these Arctic seas, and they're trying to get to Murmansk and Archangel and the various ports to supply the Russians, and just the conditions they go through. And one of the guys says, you know, because of the U-boat menace, they were told that they couldn't really stop if another ship was hit or there's men in the water. And he does this appallingly moving description of just one of the ships, one of the destroyers is tasked, it has to go past, but there's men in the water and they know they can't be picked up. And just out of the waves and out of all this terrible sea and the melee that's going on at the time, out comes a voice yelling from between the waves, "Taxi, taxi," as the ship goes past, knowing that they can't stop and pick them up, sort of thing, you know. But all those, just as I'm particularly used to the tank memoirs, you know, there's the naval ones, there's all these other areas of the history of conflict where there's great first-hand accounts. And and the fact Ludovic Kennedy was there, he takes you through that pursuit of the Bismarck to its sinking from someone who was there at the time, and that you know, gives a drama and something extra to it. I better move on.